The Emerging Civil War podcast. I'm scratchy voiced Chris Mackowski today, and joining me from the great state of Mississippi is my good friend Tim Smith. Tim, how are you today?
Hello, doing well. I'm just right across the border. So
Okay. Oh, that's right. That's right. It's but like you speak Mississippi, so
I
that's what
speak
I was. That's
Mississippian,
right.
but and I grew up there.
And I'm thinking Mississippi because we're going to talk about the Vicksburg campaign today, so that's why Mississippi's on the brain for me. Um, as we're talking about partnerships and rivalries heading into our upcoming summer symposium, one of the partnership rivalries I wanted to really kind of take a look at centers on the Vicksburg campaign and William Sherman and John McClernand particularly, and of course Grant's going to be in that mix because he can't not be. But I think a really interesting dynamic going into 1863 with this pivotal campaign on the line, and we've got some personalities that are trying to figure out how to mesh.
Definitely, and both McClernand and Sherman, they're so bombastic, and the old saying, "They walk in a room mouth first," kind of thing. And so when you throw those two together and add in McPherson, of course, and Grant, who both of whom are a little quieter and a little calmer, it makes for a pretty good tale.
So, give us the quick thumbnail sketch of who John McClernand is, because he's kind of, I think, the thorn in the side of everybody as this tale gets going.
Well, that's the normal conception, and he's so obnoxious that he just can't help but be a thorn in the side. But he does some pretty good work at Shiloh, at Fort Donelson, and in the Vicksburg campaign. He just doesn't have the backing of Grant and Sherman and others. He at one point has the backing of Abraham Lincoln and Secretary Stanton, but that quickly falls away as well. And so he's kind of hung out on a limb and doesn't survive long in the command. He's a congressman. He starts the war as a very well known name. He had actually been in the running for Speaker of the House, had not acquired the position, but he had been a very well known congressman. Friend of Abraham Lincoln. There's some debate as to how friendly they actually were, but Lincoln will appoint him a general, of course, as part of these Democrats from Southern Illinois, Southern Indiana, Ohio, trying to keep those regions, Little Egypt, secure in the Union. So right off, immediately off the bat, you get the dynamic of McClernand, who has been there, done that, big wig player in Washington, all of that, all of a sudden being commanded by Ulysses S. Grant, who, while McClernand was in Congress, Grant was trying to make a living selling firewood in St. Louis, and was pretty much deemed a failure, and in some circles a drunk. Certainly the Army circles, word had gotten around, truthfully or untruthfully, that Grant had resigned because he was drunk, all of that. So you can kind of understand McClernand's position a little bit. Hey, I was a congressman. I'm a mover and shaker on the national level, and here's this upstart Grant giving me orders. That it doesn't sit well with him, and you throw in the bombastic personality that McClernand has, and Grant does his level best to try to assuage that and to try to work with McClernand. Sherman, not so much. Sherman just as well, shoot him in the head or something and get rid of him. But Grant tries his best to get along with McClernand until he just can't anymore.
And yeah, I think people forget, or maybe they don't realize, like when Grant was still kind of trying to get his first colonelcy, and he finally gets it. McClernand and John Logan are the two men who welcome him officially to the army and give speeches on Grant's behalf and
Yeah.
kind of serve as Grant cheerleaders.
Well, yeah, that was when Grant was still in his place and had not gone over the top of McClernand. So things change a little bit when McClernand's no longer the top dog, if you will.
You made a really good point at the beginning there, where you said that McClernand does some good work, and yeah, I maybe kind of want to stress that a little bit because in my own studies of Vicksburg, and and kind of under your guidance and tutelage, and I really kind of came to appreciate that McClernand's pretty good on the battlefield, despite his reputation as being a quote unquote political general.
Right. Yeah. Well, there are some fairly good political generals that make pretty good fighters. John Logan, for instance, Frank Blair, for all of his issues, Frank Blair turns out fairly well. McClernand, it's somewhat of a mixed bag. You have to take the good and the bad. You have to take the performance with the mouth kind of thing, and but even again going back to Fort Donelson, McClernand fights hard at Fort Donelson. At Shiloh, he and Sherman actually worked together. You know, politics and emergencies make strange bedfellows, I guess, and they put aside any differences of rank and all of that and glory and just try to survive, and they actually work together. And of course, in the Vicksburg campaign, McClernand kind of garners a lot of the more difficult assignments, and that probably has more to do with Sherman's reluctance and McPherson's inexperience and Hurlbut's drunkenness probably than it does McClernand's ability. But Grant, as particularly as he's starting the seventh and final do or die effort to get to Vicksburg. The others had been not do or die. They had been small risk, high reward type things. But this last one, crossing the river and marching up to Vicksburg, this is do or die. It's high risk, high reward if it works. And McClernand is the one that leads the march southward on the west side of the river, leads the crossing of the Mississippi River, which is the most delicate of delicate operations there, and then leads the effort partway northward, and then when Grant gets to the really squirrely parts where he starts moving eastward toward Jackson, needing someone to cover his rear from the main Confederate body under John Pemberton, it's McClernand that's covering the rear, and so the really delicate parts here, McClernand gets a lot of the really important assignments, and again, I think that's maybe not so much. If Grant had his choice, he would probably have rather Sherman be completely on board and supportive of this and Sherman do all that. But as we know, Sherman was not necessarily on board. McClernand was, dependable to a certain extent, but you always have that quest for glory and opportunistic idea of taking command himself at some point. McPherson is pretty inexperienced. So I've come to the conclusion in terms of these corps commanders that that Grant wins the Vicksburg campaign. This is more of a testimony to Grant than anything. Grant wins the Vicksburg campaign not because of his corps commanders. You can throw Hurlbut and Memphis in with this as well. But he wins the Vicksburg campaign in spite of his corps commanders, which he's battling the enemy, but he's also battling each of the nuances of personalities with each of these corps commanders, and McClernand is certainly a pretty complex one in that regard.
You've talked a little bit about Donelson and Shiloh, and of course the Vicksburg campaign. We'll get more into that too. But let me back us up to Belmont for a second, because a lot of people just overlook Belmont, but because McClernand is involved there and he's involved with kind of the escape from Belmont, he's got Lincoln's ears, and so he's the one who's basically saying like, yeah, this was an awesome, fantastic victory, which bolsters Grant, and maybe intentionally or not. Tell me a little bit about kind of that dynamic and how kind of McClernand does a lot to set Grant up for success because of that.
Yeah, he does, and even it could be argued at Fort Donelson, a lot of Grant's success becoming unconditional surrender Grant is partially due to McClernand, and McClernand, I think, begins to think very quickly that this guy I'm pushing is getting a little too, the monster is growing a little too big here. I've created a monster, and he's quickly superseding me, and that of course becomes problematic. It's almost like President Polk in the Mexican War with Zachary Taylor. You're creating a monster who might just run for the presidency in 1848, and lo and behold, he does and wins the thing. And he tries to, probably too late, he tries to clip his wings a little bit and puts the next invasion under Winfield Scott, but it's too little, too late, and Zachary Taylor, of course, wins the presidency. That's not too far of a stretch dealing with McClernand, because McClernand's ultimate goal is the presidency. He would like nothing more than to be president of the United States, unless it's king of something, that would probably be even better, dictator. But his, he doesn't shy away from political ambition. And even as early as Belmont, when he's winning these victories, I think it's kind of a idea of a rising tide raises all boats, and McClernand's boat will be seen much better than Grant's. So who cares if Grant's boat rises a little bit? But then Grant's boat, to continue the analogy, gets bigger and bigger and overtakes McClernand's, of course. And that's when the problems really begin.
So before we kind of shift into that start of those problems, let me shift gears a little bit and talk, ask you to talk a little bit about Sherman and give us kind of the thumbnail sketch of him at the beginning of the war and as his place in the Western theater starts to gel.
Right. Well, he actually began in the Eastern Theater. Of course, he led a brigade at First Manassas, and in fact, I was doing something the other day about Sherman, and I honestly don't remember what I was doing. But at any rate, Sherman, I believe, his brigade loses more men at First Manassas than any other Union brigade in terms of casualties. So. We don't often associate Sherman with First Manassas much, but he was there. Transferred out west, of course, and becomes the department of the Ohio commander, basically in that stream of commanders that included Robert Anderson and eventually Don Carlos Buell. That's when he has this nervous breakdown, if you will, and really tells the truth. Again, Sherman has no filter, and he probably would have been a little better off to couch his arguments in a little better context. But he just blurts out that it's going to take years and several 100,000 men to clear out the Mississippi Valley, and everybody called him crazy. He started believing it a little bit and has this nervous breakdown. It's actually Henry Halleck that brings Sherman back. Everybody talks about Grant and Sherman's relationship and all that, and it is close, obviously. But it's actually Halleck that brings Sherman back, and Sherman supports the Fort Donelson campaign, of course, from Paducah, providing Grant reinforcements and supplies and all that. And then, of course, Sherman is reinstated as commander of a division and then leads the way southward, obviously. Into southwestern Tennessee, ultimately to Pittsburgh Landing, and the rest thereafter, kind of, as we say, is history, of course.
Yeah.
But Sherman gets a second chance, and who of us in life don't want second and third and fourth and fifth chances when we blow it, But he absolutely makes the best of his second chance.
And a lot of people kind of look at that Grant Sherman relationship as being so instrumental in, the final year of the war, year and a half of the war. But they didn't start out as bosom pals when the war began. How did they develop that friendship?
Well, it's through trial, obviously, and a lot of people argue that the Shiloh crisis was a lot of the melding together of Grant and Sherman. I agree with that to a certain extent. I do think, however, Sherman, he's a pretty smart cookie. And even post Shiloh Corinth campaign, even in the summer of 1862, fall of 1862, Sherman is still somewhat hedging his bets. If you read his correspondence, yeah, he's all gung ho with Grant and friends and talks him out of resigning and all that kind of stuff, obviously. But at the same time, he's still writing very affectionate, close letters to Halleck. keeping it, 1 foot in Halleck's camp, 1 foot in Grant's camp. And I think what he's doing probably is hedging his bets a little bit to see which one that he really needs to hook his wagon to, and which one's going to go the farthest. And ultimately, of course, that's Grant. And Sherman manages to become very close, obviously, with Grant. The trial and error of the Vicksburg campaign as well, the initial stages, adds to that. Um, it's it's not so close of a friendship though that Grant doesn't um, doesn't break with Sherman when Grant decides on this seventh and final attempt to cross the river and come up behind Vicksburg from the south. Sherman is just all totally against it. I mean, absolutely against it. Two different types of theoretical mindsets here. Um, and Grant basically just ignores him. And Sherman writes a letter, and he goes personally, and Grant just says, "Well, this is what we're going to do." He doesn't tell him to the point of, you can either get on board or go home type thing, but he just chooses to ignore Sherman's advice. And this happens as they cross the river, and Sherman's saying, "Slow down and get your wagons up," and all that. And Grant says, "We don't have time to slow down. We got to move." And so it's not a total relationship that if Sherman, says jump, Grant asks how high or anything like that. Grant's his own guy. And so, I think Sherman realizes that. Sherman's such a forceful personality that normally when he says jump, people do ask how high. But Grant's a little different. And I think what really melds Sherman and Grant, because I think Grant's the kind of personality that when he decides he's a friend, it's a done deal for life kind of thing. It's there's never any doubt about it, never any going back. Um, Sherman, of course, still hedging his bets a little bit, and I think even in the Vicksburg campaign, Sherman obviously has these doubts, and so I think the real solid relationship is only confirmed and permanently secured when Sherman then comes on board and decides, all right, Grant's my man too, kind of thing. And I think that only happens when Sherman finally sees the brilliance of Grant's Vicksburg campaign. And I think it happens when they're that famous story, they're standing there overlooking where Sherman was defeated at Chickasaw Bayou in December. And Sherman basically blurts out to Grant, "Okay, I see it now. This was brilliant. You need to make a report of this, because no matter what happens with Vicksburg, this was a brilliant campaign." And I think that's when it clicks with Sherman, and he figures out this Grant knows what he's doing, and I was wrong, and he was right, and Sherman is man enough to admit that, as is Abraham Lincoln. That he writes Grant after the Vicksburg campaign, "You were right, I was wrong. I thought you should have done things differently, but you were right, and I was wrong." Interestingly, we have no evidence that McClernand ever took that route, that Grant was right and McClernand was wrong. So that shows you a little bit of the personalities, I think, there.
Yeah, I agree. That moment overlooking Chickasaw Bayou, it's sort of like where the light comes on for Sherman. He's
Yeah.
like, "Aha, I'm a
Mm-hmm.
true believer now." Yeah.
Yep. Yep.
So, so as we kind of look at the Vicksburg campaign and these personalities between Sherman and McClernand and Grant, and you'd used the phrase a little while ago, and that's when the trouble starts. As Grant starts to kind of get out from under McClernand's shadow, McClernand then looks for an opportunity to kind of rewrite the narrative and regain some of his own personal initiative by recruiting an independent command. And there's
Yeah.
that picture of him with Lincoln outside the Antietam battlefield. Like, what's McClernand doing at the Eastern Theater? But that's kind of where all this comes together. Can you outline for us what's McClernand really trying to do at that moment to recapture the narrative for himself?
Well, he's trying to eclipse Grant, obviously, and become the supreme commander. And to do that, he falls back on what he knows best. He falls back on politics, not necessarily military. And of course, Clausewitz tells us that all military is rooted in politics. And so McClernand falls back on his initial what he knows best. Is his livelihood there. And it doesn't hurt that he is friends with Lincoln, has the president's ear, and at that point is still part of the process of when McClernand speaks, people listen type thing. Maybe not asking how high to jump, but when McClernand speaks, people listen. Now over time, it gets to the point when McClernand speaks, everybody's just did somebody say something type thing. But at this point, McClernand has actually a pretty good idea. Let's go recruit troops. Let's go down and take Vicksburg. And he does a pretty good job at that. He recruits troops in Iowa and Indiana and Illinois. It's just that he is sucker punched a little bit and outsmarted and outmaneuvered by Grant and Sherman, who kind of hijack a lot of his troops in his expedition. And that, of course, becomes the Chickasaw Bayou expedition that fails. And McClernand gets wind of it, comes down, and very quickly takes over at that point. So, yeah, he falls back on politics. He uses his relationship with the president to try to get what he wants, and he is not afraid to continue to use that all through the Vicksburg campaign. When something happens that he doesn't like, he'll fire off a letter to Lincoln saying, hey, this is going on, help me, support me, you promised this. He has the endorsed orders from Lincoln that he walks around waving them in everybody's face. It kind of reminds me of the story the farmer with the agricultural government ag agent comes along and wants to examine his field, and the farmer says, don't go in that field. And the ag agent says, I'm a government agent, I can go in that field. And he says, don't go in that field. And the ag agent says, I got papers, look at my papers. And the farmer says, don't go in that field. Well, finally the ag agent says, I'm going in that field. And he gets about halfway over, and here comes a bull, and he's running back across the field trying to get out away from that bull. And the farmer yells, show him them papers. So the bull cares nothing about the papers, and ultimately Grant and Sherman just ignore the papers. And what's key in this, eventually when Lincoln and Stanton and Halleck to a certain degree get what they want out of McClernand, which is largely troops, they back away from it as well, and so the papers no longer mean what they did at one time. And McClernand, you have to admit he's kind of hung out to dry. He's kind of, and it's not fair, and he thinks it's not fair, and he voices that. But who said war was fair? You got to play them hot hand.
And you mentioned Halleck, and there's this weird moment where, Grant and Halleck are actually rowing on the same team for a little bit. And this is a point where Halleck and Grant are kind of butting heads and at cross purposes, although Grant doesn't quite realize it at this point. But suddenly Halleck starts backing Grant, which is not something he's typically doing during this period.
The enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so there is a greater cause of concern. I wouldn't say enemy, but there's a greater concern in McClernand that temporarily melds Halleck and Grant together in the common foe. And I shouldn't say foe either, but common sideshow, if you will. But now Halleck is exactly the same boat as McClernand. He started off much higher than Grant. Grant eventually overtakes him, eclipses him, and Halleck's star, burns out just like McClernand's does. And so it's a testimony really to Grant, probably, that does this just ho hum slowly, just does his work, does what's asked of him, and doesn't cause a huge ruckus and all of that, and lo and behold, he comes out on top. So maybe the turtle does win the race. It's slow and steady, beats the fast and lively rabbit every time. Although I wouldn't call Halleck fast and lively. The metaphor breaks down at some point. So
There's also this really weird moment in the midst of all of this where McClernand has gathered all these troops. He's sent them to Memphis. He's going to go down there and assume command and sweep down the valley and capture. And he stops to get married. And that basically buys Grant the time to send Sherman to Shanghai those troops. Tell me about that moment.
Yeah, he does get married in Illinois before he comes southward to take over command of the army, and then it's at that point then you realize, okay, I've been hoodwinked. Um, he marries a gal about half his age. I think she's 20 something, and he's 40, late 40s. I would have to look at the exact numbers, but that sounds a little odd to us, obviously. But in those days, it wasn't quite so odd, and even more, it's his widow's younger sister, so it's kind of the I'm gonna take care of the widow's little sister type thing. But it apparently didn't hurt that she was quite a beauty, and so he gets married and does what every young new bride would just dream of. He takes her on honeymoon with the army on campaign, and she uh, she comes down with the army and through Memphis and all that, and is actually with the army still in March and April as McClernand is getting ready to cross the river, late April. We're talking 27th, 28th, 29th, and Grant's getting reports of this, and McClernand's not moving troops and supplies because he's moving his bride's baggage around, and all of that kind of stuff. So very quickly they send the wives home. Now, of course, Grant has Julia with him on occasion, and there's probably a larger context for that because Grant behaves a lot better most of the time when Julia's around to keep an eye on him. Not that he misbehaves or anything, but there's definitely a calming effect and that Julia has on Grant, and so. That would be, I hadn't thought about it, and it probably is a book. I'm not aware of it, but it would be interesting to look at generals' wives and their places in the war and what they're doing, particularly on campaign and all that. But it is truly unique experience when Mrs. McClernand goes on her honeymoon to the army. So
So when Sherman is repulsed at Chickasaw Bayou at the end of December of 62, and in sort of in the immediate wake of that defeat, McClernand shows up and says, "I'm in charge now." And they go off to capture Arkansas Post. So
the wild
January, I
chase,
think, pardon?
the wild goose chase, as
Yeah,
Grant calls it.
yeah. How formative is the Arkansas Post expedition in the context of the relationship between McClernand and Sherman, who had worked together at Shiloh, that trial by fire? There's the potential that they could actually kind of come together even more, but it seems like Arkansas Post breaks something.
Well, I'm not sure it does. I'll get to that in just a second. It shows Sherman and McClernand can still work together as long on McClernand's end as McClernand is in charge. And Sherman is not real happy about this because you've been in charge, now you're superseded and you're no longer in charge. But McClernand throws a bone to Sherman and allows Sherman some influence, and that's really all any of us asked for, probably. And it's actually Sherman's idea to go up to Arkansas Post and do this. Now, when Grant gets word of this, of course, he calls it a wild goose chase and has a come apart about it, and calls McClernand almost everything in the book. Nothing dirty, of course. Grant didn't have a potty mouth, but he's very much against this until he learns that it was Sherman's idea, and then Grant kind of flips the switch a little bit and says, "Oh well, yeah, we did get a little bit of good out of this," and so Grant is not infallible. That's a little bit of a problem for Grant there. But you're talking about breaks. I think the word you used was break something.
Yeah.
What this breaks is Grant's mentality in terms of commanding the whole and allowing if you want to call it tactical or even operational commander to do the actual work down at Vicksburg. First of all, he had sent Sherman down there, of course, and then McClernand's down there. And so what it solidifies in Grant's mind is that I was okay with Sherman actually commanding the army down there while I command the whole, as long as it was Sherman. Now that it's McClernand, I'm not okay with that. And so what I'm going to do is take personal command myself of both the department and the overall operation and the on site command. And so Grant himself goes down eventually to Young's Point, has to put McClernand in his place a couple of times. McClernand refers it all the way to Washington. And this is when Washington starts backing away from their deal just a little bit, but it turns out that this is where Grant takes personal command, and he'll never relinquish that, of course, and ultimately wind up with Vicksburg. So yeah, Arkansas Post is extremely important. I wouldn't say so much in causing issues between Sherman and McClernand, but causing Grant to take the overall command would be my view of it.
And and I'll ask you to speculate here because I can't think of anything myself that like Grant actually wrote down. Here's why I don't have confidence in McClernand, but he does say he doesn't have confidence, but he doesn't say why. And knowing that McClernand had done good service for him on the battlefield in the past, why is it now suddenly he doesn't have faith in McClernand to be in charge of the operations down there?
Well, I, I think there's a lot of and people really grill Halleck for this, but I think there's something to Grant's idea that he's not a West Pointer, he's a politician, doesn't know what he's doing. Um, there is a little bit of evidence. Grant goes down. He makes one trip down to Richmond, Louisiana, and kind of feels things out. Talks to Sherman, talks to Admiral Porter and others, and then he goes back to Memphis to get everything situated. And then he goes down permanently a little bit later, I believe, in January. But it's in that fact finding trip that Grant talks to a lot of people, and he actually writes Washington. Halleck, maybe I can't remember exactly who, but says everybody I talked to, and I did not elicit explanations. I did not ask for this, but everybody I talked to says McClernand can't handle this. He is not capable of this large an operation, and they do not want to fight under him. And so there is some evidence of why Grant is not interested in this, but we see that all the way back. Grant, it's one of those things. I think I mentioned it earlier that when Grant makes up his mind's pretty much made up. There's
Right.
not a lot of change in his mind. Like the old story, he never wanted to go backwards. He always wanted to go forward, kind of thing. Kind of an odd duck in that manner. But at any rate, we see before Shiloh when the army has moved down to Pittsburgh Landing from Savannah. Grant's headquarters still in Savannah, and the ranking commander at Pittsburgh Landing is Sherman until McClernand's division moves southward, which makes McClernand the ranking commander because, of course, C.F. Smith is injured at this point and not on site. So anyway, McClernand, of course, McClernand outranks Smith anyway, but McClernand is the ranking commander on site, and Grant just about has a fit over this and says, I cannot leave McClernand in charge of the army. And he very quickly makes plans to move his headquarters from Savannah just as soon as Buell arrives down to Pittsburgh Landing. It's in those critical days immediately before Shiloh, the third, fourth, fifth, all of that, that Grant spends all day, every day down at Pittsburgh Landing. First thing he does when he gets up in the morning, goes down to Pittsburgh Landing, doesn't return until after dark. And even on the, I believe, fourth, when Sherman gets in that minor scrape, even I think it's after dark that Grant returns back down there because he doesn't want McClernand in charge at this point. The only reason he's still in town in Savannah on the morning of the 6th is that he's gotten word that Buell's there and he wants to meet with Buell. So that's the exception. And it just so happens that it's that morning that the Confederates attack. And for a little while there, McClernand is the ranking commander. at Pittsburgh Landing until Grant arrives, but I haven't seen any evidence that he exercises that larger command. That is a fear of Grant's all the way back to Shiloh, and probably even to Fort Donelson when he leaves and goes to talk to Admiral Foote. He leaves orders that nobody move, nobody do anything. He doesn't designate a commander in his absence, which would have been McClernand, the ranking commander. He just doesn't leave anybody in charge. So I see antecedents of this all the way back earlier, probably because Grant makes up his mind pretty early that this guy's a politician, not a general, and we can't trust him.
Yeah. One of the things that got me kind of thinking about this whole network of relationships is a letter that Sherman writes to Ellen, his wife, late March, early May, where he refers to McClernand as my demon spirit. And it is a scathing letter where he's just absolutely excoriating, how awful a human being McClernand is and how much he hates him. How
Calls
does
him a dog
Sherman
at one
get to
point.
that point?
Yeah. How did Sherman get to that point? Yeah, he calls him a dog at one point. I think a lot of it is probably Sherman watching what McClernand is doing to his friend Grant, because McClernand, as I said, is not hesitant at all to contact Washington about something. He questions almost every order Grant gives, questioning even, he says at one point, this is like in January, February, when Grant takes command and starts issuing orders. McClernand says, I'm in command of this expedition. Your orders need to go through my headquarters to the rest of the corps commanders and all that. And Grant says, no, you would consider yourself commander of the 13th Army Corps, and that's it. And McClernand says, okay, we'll see what President Lincoln has to say about this. And again, that's when Lincoln starts backing away. It's pretty well known that McClernand is also informing Washington that Grant's a drunk and he's been drinking again, and those rumors going on. So I think over the course of the couple of months after Arkansas Post, when Sherman and McClernand do work together, and McClernand, as I said, throws him a bone and allows a little bit of input and influence. Sherman watches what McClernand does at this point. I think McClernand thinks, all right, this is my last shot to get ultimate command. I better do what I can. And McClernand just becomes really the thorn in Grant's flesh, and the the burr under the saddle, and just really becomes obnoxious and antagonistic. And Grant has to put him in his place. But I think Sherman, watching all of that, how McClernand is dealing with Grant, I think is probably where it all comes from.
Grant kind of, he has the opportunity to get rid of McClernand, but sort of keeps his powder dry well into the siege, and tell me a little bit about, why doesn't he just try to get rid of McClernand right away if McClernand's such a burr in the saddle?
Well, McClernand has political clout that is dwindling, but he still has political clout. And by the time you get it to mid-May, Grant's moving inland. He's, McClernand is performing all of these really important jobs in the campaign. The critical point is when Grant receives the letter from Stanton and says, you have the permission to remove anybody you need to remove. And actually tags on that if you don't remove somebody and it turns out to be a bad move, you will be held responsible. And everybody knows he's talking about McClernand, obviously. That arrives on May the 14th, while Grant is at Jackson. And so Grant has the opportunity right there in Jackson on May the 14th to relieve McClernand if he wanted to. It's at that point that McClernand is really playing the significant role of the rear guard toward Pemberton. So Grant obviously doesn't want to do it on the 14th, and then we get into the 15th and 16th with Champion Hill, and then the 17th. Things are moving fast. You don't want to change Corps commanders right in the middle of all that. Then, of course, the assaults and particularly the May 22nd assault doesn't jive well with Grant at all. Grant is very irritated about that. But he doesn't remove him then either. It's only later on in the siege, mid-June, June 18th, 19th, whatever, that Grant finally removes him. And I think what's going on there, and I dealt with this pretty extensively in the campaign, in the siege book, Grant only removes McClernand when he can probably get no more use out of McClernand. He's used him for everything that he needs. His political clout is probably gone, so Grant can stand the political pushback at this point. If he gets rid of McClernand, there will be some, and there was some. But he feels like I can withstand that at this point. Significantly, it's only when Grant receives the full complement of reinforcements that he's going to get. That mid-June 15th, 16th, when some of those divisions from the 9th Corps, for instance, Parks Division or Parks Corps, Herron's Division, some of those arrive and they absolutely encircle Vicksburg airtight. Vicksburg was not encircled airtight until mid-June. And so it's only then that Grant gets all the troops that he can hope to get. So he's got the full complement of troops. It's also then, so he's at his strongest militarily. It's also then that another general arrives who can actually assume command. If you remove McClernand, who's the commander of the 13th Corps? Well, that'll fall to Eugene Carr, who's the ranking division commander. And Carr is not, that's not one of our luminaries that we normally talk about. But there is another general who has come back from sick leave, and that's Edward O.C. Ord, who Grant likes and has confidence in. And it's only after Ord arrives, just the day or so before, that Grant puts all this together and says, okay, I've gotten everything I can out of McClernand. I don't need him anymore just to dig to Vicksburg, and he's not doing a particularly good job at that because he's not an engineer. The 13th Corps has fallen well behind the 15th and 17th in terms of approaches and all of that. And so it's at this point Grant says, I have nothing to lose and only to gain by removing McClernand. And so they use this episode of McClernand publishing an order without permission and all that, which is very minor in terms of actual offenses, but that's the excuse they use to get rid of McClernand. I think Charles Dana said it best in informing Washington about this. He said the publication of the order in the newspaper was the occasion, not the cause for McClernand's removal. So they finally do get rid of McClernand, and he goes kicking and screaming, but he goes.
And for folks who aren't familiar with the details of that, basically, McClernand sends an order to his corps saying, "You guys were awesome during the assaults on the 19th and 20th or 22nd, and we were better than everybody else." And then he publishes it in the paper because he wants his constituents to see that.
The
And
politics. Yeah.
Grant has ordered folks not to release official documents to the press, and so that's
That's
kind of his.
standard War Department policy that you have to have permission. And McClernand blames it on an error of his adjutant. My adjutant sent this out without my permission, and he didn't know any better, and I didn't know he was doing it. But still, it's the excuse for the action that Grant and Sherman and McPherson is funny reading the correspondence in the official records. As soon as McPherson and Sherman both see this, they know exactly we got him. Oh, this is perfect, and they can't wait to send it on to Grant and saying, "Hey, look what McClernand did. This is it." And so Grant's getting some push from his corps commanders as well, the others, to get rid of McClernand. So all the stars are aligning at this point in mid-June that Grant pulls the trigger and makes the decision.
And it's really kind of one of those things that McClernand had just brought this on himself over the course of these months of machinations.
You see this with a lot of if Lew Wallace had just kept his mouth shut a little bit more, he probably would have retained some commands and maybe risen. I don't know if McClernand would have just kept his mouth shut and worked within the system. Lincoln tried to tell him, "You're doing good for yourself. You're doing good for the country. Just stay the course." But McClernand just couldn't do it.
Talking about Grant's opportunism there and, why he keeps McClernand along. One of the moments of the war I'm fascinated with is on May 3rd when Grant has circumvented Grand Gulf and goes back in, meets the Navy, gets his correspondence. And that's when he's supposed to then move south to link up with Nathaniel Banks around Fort Hudson. And he realizes now there's this opportunity.
Mhm.
And when he was originally contemplating that move south, and he had led Halleck to believe, yeah, I'll be going to do that. And he'd thought about sending McClernand's 13th Corps, which was his largest corps at that point. But it's a way to get rid of McClernand without
Yeah,
necessarily getting rid of. But the opportunity that is presented to him there to then strike inland is enough for him to say, like, I'm not going to get rid of this problematic guy because I can use him. Um,
exactly.
and to me, that was a really enlightening moment about Grant in that circumstance.
It is, and it shows Grant's uh, grasp of the situation. This is I referred to earlier when Lincoln said, "You were right and I was wrong." This is what Lincoln was referring to. I thought you should have gone down to aid Banks at Port Hudson, and Grant. He understands what Washington wants, but yet he says, I'm not going to do it because I've got an even better opportunity here, and I'm going to try it if it costs me my command or my life or whatever. And I love his account later on. He's talking to the newspaper correspondent on his worldwide trip, and he counts how long it'll take for his message saying, "I'm not going to do this," to get back to Washington, back up river to Memphis and Cairo, and by telegraph to Washington, and then Washington's response back to Cairo and Memphis, and then downriver by boat, and then inland to Grant. And he says, "I have a little over a week," and I can just see him counting on his fingers, almost like Jethro, alt, double alt, and all that. But he says you can do a lot in 8 days, and so he goes for it, man, and takes that chance, and it ultimately works for him.
And of course, it gets more than 8 days because Robert E. Lee at Chancellorsville is distracting the War Department and, buys some
Distracting the
additional time.
world
Yeah,
and
yeah.
Stonewall Jackson's death and all of that. Absolutely.
So I had to just work that in there,
You got to
being.
get the old Stonewall in there somehow.
So as we get ready to wrap up, then what is your final assessment of that relationship between McClernand and Grant and Sherman and Grant, and how does that affect the overall course of the war?
Well, I think it's not quite what we have blown it up to be. I mean, these guys ultimately, the big picture is they ultimately work together enough to win a huge victory, and so it's not like they're tearing each other apart and shooting at each other in duels and all that kind of stuff. But I think it's the simple case of Grant who has emerged on top, using McClernand, even though he may not like him, may not fully trust him. He's using him in important ways to get what he needs, and then, for better or worse, when he gets all out of him he dumps him and turns to others. That's kind of a harsh reality, but in that the business world or the regular world, let's ride them till we can't get anything else out of them, and then move on.
Tim, I appreciate the chance to pick your brain about all this. This is fascinating.
That's been fun.
I want to remind folks about your monumental 5-volume series about the Vicksburg campaign, which is just a stunning work, one of my absolute favorite pieces of Civil War scholarship. So if you want to get more into these relationships, I urge folks to look at Tim's 5-volume piece, and he really gets into a lot of detail and depth about these relationships.
Appreciate the plug there.
Absolutely, my friend.
Enjoyed talking with you.
Always a pleasure. You have yourself a great day. I'll talk to you soon.
Thank you.
I'm Chris Mackowski for the Emerging Civil War podcast. We'll see you online and on the battlefield.